Tensions between China and Japan have been steadily rising since the end of the year 2012. Both sides are now sending signals they're preparing for a long confrontation, maybe war. So in this program, we'll try to figure out whether the war talk has any real grounds or is rather a not so uncommon media exaggeration.
We're looking at the issue together with our guest speakers. Jonas Perel-Plessner, Senior Policy Fellow with the European Council for Foreign Relations, Dr. Mathieu Duchatel, Senior Researcher and Head of the project with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, currently based in China, and Mikhail Mozachekov, Independent Journalist and Head of the Russian Club in Tokyo.
But before we proceed, Jan, I suggest we might remind our listeners of the recent chain of events. So, first of all, there was a series of statements made both by the Chinese officials and the Japanese officials. The newly elected Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Abe, said that Japan is not discussing any issue related to the disputed islands, whereas China has insisted that Japan might adopt a more rational position. However, I wonder if you've seen the publication in The Diplomat, which is the Japanese magazine. The publication carried a flashy headline. It said that Japan explores war scenarios with China. So all in all, that builds up to create a rather alarming picture of a new confrontation in the region.
Yes, it certainly does. I mean, this is a confrontation that has been building up recently over the last several months. There's already been very sort of public statements to say there should be a boycott of Japanese products within China, which has caused a maybe 4.5% fall in business with China. There's been a lot of talk within the Chinese newspapers expressing general hostility towards the Japanese. Strikes against Japanese businesses operating in China have turned violent, and the Japanese authorities have been very critical of the Chinese for allowing this to happen. And we've also seen further situations developing. Perhaps the Chinese have said they want to do a mapping project on these islands and want to put government officials on the islands.
But just as a part of the general mapping project, not necessarily the mapping project of the region alone.
No, but it's created this suspicion that Chinese officials will be going onto the island. Is it the precursor for some sort of invasion? And there are also reports that both sides are investing in drone technology to be able to nominally for surveillance purposes, but in the current climate, this has promoted quite a lot of suspicion that there could be some kind of military or hostile intent. Although clearly Japan has restated its non-aggression. It's been a sort of fairly committed to non-aggression within the region since the Second World War. But equally, these tensions, this rhetoric does have a danger of overflowing. It does stoke the tensions a lot more than perhaps is necessary.
Just to quote the Diplomat article, there's an interesting figure. It's saying that Japan's cabinet approved a supplementary budget plan of $147 billion that includes military spending for border defense. And this is what causes my alarm, because if we put aside all kinds of rhetoric, this is the substance.
Yes, once people start putting money on the table and making military budgets available for this, of course, all military spending is nominally only for defence. Nobody would openly admit to any kind of hostile or aggressive development. This is not what you would expect. But no, once the money starts coming up front, once you have a budget, once you start having people working towards that budget, it has a tendency to expand when people have an interest in developing it. So it is something that prefigures in the future some kind of further development, further tension and military conflict.
And I think that Japan is still not allowed under its own constitution to possess an army.
No, it's not. This was part of the fact that since the war, it has had to
And the article of the constitution is still in place, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's not allowed to develop that, though clearly there can be I'm sure there are some very clever lawyers that can state that what is happening is something different, or it can cooperate with international allies to achieve these aims, which the United States is clearly one of the major players within this. And you could imagine a scenario where, in order to further its defence, then there would be some quite close association with the United States if they felt that was in their interest to do so.
The situation is really shaky. But now I suggest we might turn to our experts and our guest speakers. And the first one I suggest you might listen to would be Jonas Perel-Plessner, Senior Policy Fellow with the European Council for Foreign Relations. Mr. Abe has embarked on his first international visit in the present capacity, and most experts are saying that one of the ultimate goals would be to perhaps build up the cooperation between those nations which he is visiting against the rising role of China. Is that assessment accurate? Is that correct?
Yes and no. I mean, of course, Japan has before Abe has had strong relations with nations in Southeast Asia. So in a sense, he continues that work. But I think it's true in the sense that trade-wise, Japan last year got hit by sort of these Chinese strong nationalist reactions, and trade and exports to China have gone down, particularly in the car sector. So of course, Japan is looking for new markets there. And the other aspect of sort of regional primacy, who is the sort of leader in the region with a much stronger China, also plays a certain role.
Japan is said to be considering different scenarios regarding war on China. Is that something like just ordinary mass media speculation, or does it have some substance to it?
Well, we've seen that on both sides as well, also on the Chinese side, that is from the army, some sort of preparations as well for conflict. In one way, it's a diplomatic signal. It's a way of saying that we stand firm on what we claim, and I think both parties still really want to avoid conflict. But it does also make this issue to be one of the really future hotspots for 2013 and ongoing, also because in the case of a larger crisis, then there's the question of sort of crisis management, who then steps down. And if both parties have sort of assured both public and army that they're ready to take it forward, that of course makes it harder to de-escalate.
What could be the realistic steps to kind of play down the tension?
Probably some sort of crisis management mechanism around naval issues, so that each side knows what to do in the case of incursions by fishery captains, which was one of the big issues last year, with a Chinese captain that got captured by the Japanese naval surveillance. So I mean, if some of these cases develop again, some sort of crisis mechanism for knowing how to deal with it, so that it doesn't didn't kicks off in public opinion and with strong reactions, and governments that then scramble to try to find a solution.
Sir, but what would be the position of the United States?
Yeah, I think the U.S. is not, of course, interested in that this conflict sort of blows out of proportion or goes into something from being a dormant issue into something like a hotter issue. So on the other hand, I mean, Japan is the U.S. ally. This is where they have their treaty obligations and where they have parts of their army position. So they also have certain specific obligations to Japan, which of course the Japanese are keen that they will honor. But I think of course they're very interested that it doesn't sort of blow into any type of full-scale conflict.
Sir, now the island issue has been there for quite a number of years. The end of the 2012 has seen the escalation of tension over those islands, and the escalation is still going on. So what could be the real reason for that?
The background to that is, of course, sort of more regional competition between China and Japan. A China that is much stronger now, has come well out of the financial crisis, and Japan in any ways that economically as well is weaker. So, I mean, I think the Chinese are no longer in the same way willing just to wait and wait for an issue they think. I mean, and it's a complicated issue, the territorial dispute itself. And since none of the partners are really willing to go to international arbitration to discuss it, it means it's left to their own means. And if you have both partners taking a stronger and stronger stand, then it's difficult to see where it stops.
If we talk about the new government of Japan, the new prime minister, what do we need to expect of him?
Well, he's expected to be, more hawkish in the sense that he will stand more firm on Japanese demands. that in a way can actually also, since he's seen that like that also internally in Japan, can make it easier for him to negotiate rather than had he been seen more as a dove, meaning that he doesn't necessarily face the internal criticism if he tries to sort of start looking at negotiation options on this. So I mean, in a sense, one interpretation would be saying having a more sort of nationalist prime minister would increase the chances of tension. It could also go the other way, that he's actually a type that he can negotiate frankly with the Chinese and try to sort of find some conflict-reducing mechanism, because he's not seen as sort of weak on the issue internally in Japan. It was more the pragmatic side that came through. He was actually the one that came in after Koizumi and was one of the first to start repairing relations with China, which has gone down quite low in 2005 when, because of these visits by the then Japanese Prime Minister Koizumi to the Yasukuni Shrine, which is a shrine in Tokyo that, among other things, also houses Japanese war criminals from the Second World War, and which then sort of infuriates the Chinese public. And Abe at that time stopped doing that and repaired sort of relations with China. So I think that at least shows the second interpretation I gave before, the sort of more pragmatic, that even though he's seen as a sort of more hawkish, more nationalist, he also has a sort of pragmatic touch to negotiating with neighbors, including China.
Sir, thank you so much. And just a reminder, our guest speaker was Jonas Perel-Plessner, Senior Policy Fellow with the European Council for Foreign Relations.
Burning Point.
Just to remind you, we're discussing the strained relationship between Japan and China.
And now we are joined by another expert coming to us from China, and I'm happy to present to you Dr. Matthew Duchatel, Senior Researcher and Head of the project with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute.
Well, there are two different narratives, depending if you see this from Japan or from China. The main narrative in China is that Japan unilaterally transformed the status quo by purchasing the islands in September last year. And this unilateral transformation of the status quo was created in reaction a number of policy initiatives by China to reestablish another status quo. From the Japanese government point of view, the central government purchased the three of the islands that the Japanese call the Senkaku and the Chinese the Diaoyu Islands, in reaction to an attempt by Tokyo to purchase the islands. So they see this as to protect the status quo, because the mayor of Tokyo is known for being very close to the very national rights wing in Japan, and if he had purchased the islands, this would have created a lot of instability, because he would have probably encouraged Japanese right-wing movements to land on the islands, and that would have been perceived as a provocation by China. So it all started with the purchase of the islands by the central Japanese government, and the situation, starting from that point, increasingly deteriorated to the point where we are now, with the Japanese military and coast guards patrolling the islands, with the Chinese State Oceanic Administration and Fisheries Law Enforcement Command also patrolling the island, and this is creating a very dangerous situation, because you have planes and ships from both sides sailing or flying to each other, and there is a serious risk of incidents from the islands now.
Sir, but I've also seen a statement made by Mr. Abe that when he said that there is no room to negotiate the Japanese stance on the islands with China. However, the Chinese party is saying that rational policy is needed from Mr. Abe's government. So how do you see that? How could the positions be brought to a sort of a rational basis? What needs to be done?
Right. Well, I think that the Chinese have a very clear strategic objective. No, I might say even a tactical objective for the short term. They want the central government in Japan to recognize the fact that there is a dispute over the islands. And as you said, the Japanese government doesn't recognize that there is a dispute. So this is a tactical objective for China. And this is one of the reasons why the Chinese are now patrolling within the territorial sea around the islands, while in the past they were not approaching the territorial seas, but not getting into the territorial seas. So that's to force the Japanese government to recognize that there is a dispute. So that would be a political victory for China, and that would be, I could argue, that's how the Chinese define a re-establishment of the status quo. So the Japanese purchased the islands, but now they recognize that there is a dispute. So we have reached some sort of new status quo between the two countries. How to handle this rationally, very hard to say. There are two things, I think. The first is for countries to focus on other issues. I think that now that the tensions are running very high and that there is a tit-for-tat mechanism with each side retaliating for actions taken by the other side, the main priority would be for China and Japan to focus on other issues. But I think that it will take, at least in China, a recognition that there is a new status quo over the Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands, with the Japanese having purchased the islands and the Chinese now being able to patrol within the territorial seas of the islands. This is really about how you perceive the situation. But in the long term, I think that there is no easy solution to the sovereignty question over the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands. Both the Japanese and the Chinese governments are not interested in having the International Court of Justice giving a judgment about the sovereignty over the islands. And that would obviously be the best alternative to military tensions and political disputes.
Mr. Abe has started his first international visit in the capacity of the Prime Minister. And the general perception of the expert community is that the ultimate goal of the visit would be to create some sort of a coalition in the confrontation with China. What could be the positions of the governments of the countries he's visiting on the issue?
Right. Well, I think that Japan's strategy towards China is very clearly evolving towards balancing. And balancing includes both internal balancing, so that's about troop deployment, that's about defense expenditures, and is acting swiftly on this. I think that he has a democratic mandate to push forward the national defense agenda. And then the second part of balancing is external balancing. So it means increasing security cooperation with the U.S., but it means also becoming a stakeholder in the South China Sea. That's something that the Chinese really profoundly dislike, and that can explain Japanese moves vis-à-vis the Philippines, Vietnam. Over the past 2 weeks, they have been pretty active in developing some, and even with Cambodia, there has been a major Japanese investment project. I think they are moving very, very quickly on both dimensions, external and internal balancing. I think that for countries in Southeast Asia, depending on which countries you're speaking of, but at least for Vietnam and the Philippines, they can see there an opportunity to hedge against the rise of China. Countries that have their own sovereignty disputes with China in the South China Sea. So they will seize the opportunity just to get more resources and to feel stronger in case they can enter in negotiations with China. But I don't think that they will go very, very far in developing security cooperation with Japan.
Sir, thank you so much. And just to remind you, our guest speaker this time was Dr. Matthew Duchatel, Senior Researcher and Head of the Project with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Well, and finally, we're joined by our next guest speaker, Mikhail Mozhychkov, independent journalist and head of the Russian Club in Tokyo. Sir, thank you so much for joining us. The basic question, I'm sure our audience would love to know your opinion as to, do we really need to expect a war between Japan and China?
I don't think that a war between Japan and China might be in the nearest future, because none of the countries seriously considering this development of the situation. But basically both of the countries are preparing. So if we look at, for example, first movements of the Abe government, then he increased the budget for the self-defense forces of Japan. And also they are now doing some training, for example, paratrooper forces and other forces. And one of the tasks of those trainings is defending of the remote islands. So Japan is clearly showing that they are planning to defend those islands in case of the Chinese intervention. Also, there were joint training between U.S. and Japanese paratroopers and military forces for defending of the island. So I think that Japan is seriously considering the possibility of China trying to take those islands by force.
But do you think that the Chinese would go that far?
Difficult to say, but one of the reasons, for example, of the escalation of the conflict in the last year was problems in the Chinese economy, which put the Chinese government to a very unstable position. I think that was one of the reasons why China raised the problem with the islands, and they tried to somehow facilitate the national aid to Japan, because any government which feels unstable is looking for an external enemy, and for China it was easy to do. So I don't think they will go that far, but they are trying to show to Japan, and not only to Japan, but also to the main partner of Japan in the military, to United States. Their forces are strong enough to control the Pacific Ocean. One of the, not the accidents, but one of the main events on this is using the ex-Soviet air carrier, which China, through a special military service, bought from Ukraine, the ex-Soviet Republic. And at the moment, they are showing to the whole world that they have an air carrier. At the moment, China has a very extensive program of building air carriers. So some of the experts say that by 2016, the fleet of China would be at least not stronger, but at least comparable to the U.S. fleet in Pacific Ocean.
This is an alarming analysis you're giving us. But with Mr. Abe now touring some regional countries, trying to get more support in his confrontation with China, do you think that the governments of those countries are prepared to grant Japan the support Mr. Abe is seeking?
I'm not sure that he will get what he actually expects from this visit, but the reasons of the visit are quite clear, because at the moment there is a strong pressure from China. There are Chinese ships which are going to the territorial waters around the disputed islands. That's why also there are a lot of conflicts at the moment between China and Philippines, China and Malaysia, etc., on the islands, which may have some natural resources around them. That's why I think that Japan is not alone in the fear of China, because other countries, I can mention Philippines again, or Vietnam, they have territorial disputes with China. And if China gets stronger, no one country of the region can solely be against China. That's why I think Abe-san is trying to make allies around so they can withstand the pressure from China.
Sir, do you think we could remind very briefly our listeners about the maritime ambitions of China?
At the moment, the military ambitions of China is become the first power in the Pacific Ocean. I think that's the main target, because at the moment China has huge troops, but those troops is very difficult to transport. You cannot win the war just with the machine guns. That's why basically they are looking into expansion of their fleet, especially air carriers. And in the future, they want to solve disputes with countries around them with force, I think, in the ocean, because all the disputes of China are for the remote islands. And at the moment, as you know, the international laws, as you know, the laws for the marine areas, for example, to claim a certain area of the ocean, you just need a small island there. So if China can claim all those islands, they will get a huge area where they can feed for the fishery, for expanding their search for natural resources, oil and gas. And this race, I think, started after 1970s when United Nations made a search for natural resources in this area. It was stated that all of those islands may have gas and oil. So I think that the main purpose is natural resources.
Just to draw a line under our interview, do I get it right that we are in for more confrontation in the region?
I would say yes. I think Japan is seriously preparing to confrontation, and China does. So all the signs I can see on the political arena at the moment, then Japan, for example, is several times asked U.S. on all the levels if they will support them in case of the conflict around those islands. They are looking for support from all those other countries of the region. And at the moment, the military budget of Japan increased. They are increasing the forces. They put special marines in the area of the disputed islands. So I would say, at least from the perception of Japan, they are very seriously preparing to that conflict.
Sir, thank you so much.